Kneel down. Don Marco Vittorio's command sliced through the elegant silence of Vittorio's like a blade. 200 pairs of eyes from across the dining room snapped toward the VIP table, where the Mafia boss stood rigid as a king issuing judgment. His gold Rolex caught the candlelight as he pointed down at the black waitress standing before him. I said, "Kneel down and apologize for ruining my $15,000 Brioni suit." Imani Rose stood motionless, her fingers gripping a white cloth napkin that trembled slightly in her grasp. Drops of red wine still gleamed on the marble floor, evidence of the performance Don Marco had just orchestrated. The entire restaurant held its breath, waiting to see if the young woman would break. Two of Don Marco's men stood near the entrance, their presence a silent reminder that defiance here carried consequences far worse than unemployment. "No." Imani's voice cut like ice through the suffocating silence. Don Marco Vittorio had no idea he'd just awakened the wrong monster. The air vibrated with pressure like a held note about to break. Don Marco's face flushed crimson, his perfectly groomed appearance doing nothing to hide the rage building beneath. He stepped closer to Imani, his handcrafted Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble like a countdown to violence. "Excuse me?" Don Marco's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the dining room. "Did you just tell me no?" The fake spill had served its purpose. Now came the real performance. The other diners maintained their pretense of dining, but fear crackled through the room like electricity before a lightning strike. Everyone here knew who Don Marco was and what happened to people who crossed him. "I said no, Mr. Vittorio." Imani's voice remained steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. She had watched the deliberate choreography moments earlier, the staged accident, the theatrical gasp, the perfectly timed outrage. None of it had been real except the malice behind it. "I will not kneel down and apologize for something I didn't do." Don Marco's eyes narrowed with the cold calculation of a predator. In his world of underground casinos and backroom deals, defiance was as rare as honesty. Those who dared to stand against him usually didn't stand for long. The Mafia boss blinked slowly, recalibrating his attack strategy. "How dare you?" Don Marco's voice made the crystal chandeliers tremble. "Do you know who I am? I own this city. The police, the judges, the politicians, they all answer to me." He snapped his fingers, and David Thompson, the restaurant manager, came scurrying over like a well-trained lapdog. Thompson was a thin, nervous man who had spent years perfecting the art of serving powerful criminals while pretending they were legitimate businessmen. His eyes darted between Don Marco and Imani, calculating which side would keep him alive. The answer was obvious. "Mr. Vittorio, I am so terribly sorry about this incident," he stammered, wringing his hands like prayer beads. Thompson turned to Imani with barely concealed disgust. "Rose, what have you done now?" The question was loaded with assumptions that she was guilty, that this wasn't her first offense, that someone like her was naturally prone to trouble. Imani had worked at Vittorio's for 8 months, without a single complaint, earning more in tips than servers with twice her experience through sheer professionalism. But none of that mattered when faced with Don Marco Vittorio's word against hers. "I suggest you apologize immediately," Thompson continued, his voice dripping with false authority. "Mr. Vittorio is our most valued patron. His loyalty had a price tag, and Don Marco owned it outright. I won't apologize for something I didn't do," Imani repeated, her voice growing stronger with each word. Her mother's hospital bills were crushing, but dignity was priceless. The medical debt climbed toward $30,000 while machines beeped out the rhythm of borrowed time, but even desperation had its limits. This job was her lifeline, yet some prices were too high to pay. "If you fire me for telling the truth, then so be it." The words tasted like freedom and terror in equal measure. She was walking a tightrope over financial ruin, but she would walk it with her spine straight. Don Marco's fury melted into cruel delight. This was better than he had hoped for. Not just submission, but complete destruction. "Fire her?" He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh no, firing is too good for someone like her. I want her to understand her place in this world." He began to circle Imani, his voice carrying to every corner of the restaurant with practiced projection. "You people need to learn respect. You need to understand that there are consequences for stepping out of line. People who disrespect me have a way of disappearing from this city. or sometimes they just disappear. The coded language wasn't lost on anyone present. Phones emerged from purses and pockets, capturing every moment for social media posterity. The weight of being watched pressed down on Imani's shoulders like a physical force. She could see herself tomorrow, viral video sensation, the uppity waitress who forgot her station. The comments would be vicious, the judgment swift and merciless. But something deep inside her refused to break. Perhaps it was her mother's voice, weak but proud, reminding her that dignity couldn't be bought or sold. Perhaps it was her grandfather's ghost, who had faced down worse than Don Marco Vittorio and lived to tell about it. "My place," Imani said quietly, her voice cutting through the restaurant's charged atmosphere, "is not on my knees." Don Marco's face contorted with fury. "Your place is wherever I say it is. I know the mayor, the police chief, every judge in this city. One phone call from me and you'll never work in this town again. One phone call and maybe you don't walk out of here at all." He snapped his manicured fingers for emphasis, the sound sharp as a whip crack. Two of his men took a step closer, their intentions clear. The threat hung in the air like poison gas seeping into every corner of the room. Other servers stopped what they were doing, their faces pale with vicarious fear. They had all heard stories of powerful men crushing those who dared to oppose them. It was the unspoken rule of service industry survival in a restaurant owned by the mob. Keep your head down, smile, and never, ever fight back. Thompson seized the moment, sensing which way the wind was blowing with the instincts of a career survivor. "Rose, you're suspended immediately. Clean out your locker and leave the premises." His voice carried the satisfaction of a man who had chosen the winning side and knew it. "Security will escort you out." Two burly guards appeared as if summoned by magic, their presence designed to add a final layer of humiliation to Imani's defeat. But these weren't ordinary security guards. They were Don Marco's men, and everyone knew the difference. The other staff members averted their eyes, ashamed of their own cowardice but unwilling to risk their own safety. Solidarity was a luxury they couldn't afford in a world where rent came due every month and threats were real. Don Marco smiled triumphantly, already savoring his victory and planning how he would tell this story at his next family gathering. The defeated waitress would become an amusing anecdote, a cautionary tale about knowing one's place in the natural order of things. As the guards approached, Imani clutched the white napkin tighter in her fist. Hidden in its folds was the embroidered reminder of who she really was. Dr. Imani Rose, MBA, stitched in delicate thread, a secret weapon waiting for the right moment to be revealed. She looked directly into Don Marco Vittorio's cold, dark eyes and saw something the Mafia boss had missed completely. Not defeat, but calculation. Not submission, but strategy. "This isn't over," Imani said quietly, her words carrying a promise that made Don Marco's smile falter for just a heartbeat. The guards flanked her as she walked toward the exit, her head held high despite the whispers following in her wake. Behind her, she left a room full of people who thought they had just witnessed a destruction. They had no idea they had actually watched the first move in a game Don Marco Vittorio didn't even realize he had entered. The evening rain drummed against the windows of Imani's modest apartment as she sat across from her mother at their small kitchen table. Dorothy Rose looked fragile in her faded pink robe, the chemotherapy having stolen 30 pounds from her once robust frame. But her eyes still held the fire that had raised a daughter to never back down from bullies. "Tell me what happened, baby," Dorothy said, reaching across the table to squeeze Imani's hand with fingers that felt like bird bones wrapped in tissue paper. Imani recounted the evening's events, watching her mother's expression shift from concern to pride to quiet fury. "That man thinks he can break you because of the color of your skin and the uniform you wear," Dorothy said finally. "He doesn't know who he's dealing with, does he?" The smile that crossed her weathered face held secrets that only a mother who had sacrificed everything for her child's education could possess. "No, Mama, he doesn't." Imani pulled out her laptop, the same one that had carried her through 2 years at Harvard Business School before financial reality forced her into service jobs. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the muscle memory of someone who had once commanded spreadsheets and financial models instead of carrying plates and taking orders. Don Marco Vittorio thinks he knows everything about everyone, but he's about to learn that assumptions can be dangerous. The screen glowed as search engines revealed their secrets. Organized crime databases, property records, business registrations, and federal watch lists. Every digital breadcrumb that the Vittorio family had left in their wake of violence and corruption was about to be examined under a microscope. Information was power, and Imani Rose had spent years learning how to weaponize data. The first hour of research painted a picture of typical Mafia operations. Multiple legitimate businesses serving as fronts, political donations, and enough charity events to make the organization appear respectable to those who didn't look too closely. But as Imani dug deeper, cracks began to appear in the Vittorio Empire's pristine facade. Don Marco's restaurant chain had been flagged by health inspectors 3 times in the past year, but complaints mysteriously disappeared. There were whispers on community forums about small business owners forced to pay protection money, and 2 assault cases had been quietly dismissed when witnesses refused to testify. Interesting, Imani murmured, copying links and building a digital file that would have impressed her old professors. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. A criminal organization bleeding legitimacy while maintaining the appearance of respectability. Classic signs of mob activity wrapped in designer suits and charitable donations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica Martinez, her former study partner from Harvard who now worked as a forensic auditor with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. "Girl, I saw the video from tonight. Are you okay?" Jessica's message was followed by 3 flame emojis and a link to social media, where the confrontation was already being dissected by strangers. Imani felt her stomach clench as she read the comments, some supportive, others vicious, all missing the larger picture of what had really happened. She quickly typed back, "I'm fine. Question for you. What do you know about the Vittorio family?" The response came within minutes, accompanied by a phone call that would change everything. "Imani, honey, you need to be very careful." Jessica's voice was low and urgent. "The Vittorio organization is under federal investigation. We've been building a RICO case for 5 years. I can't say more over the phone, but Don Marco Vittorio is not someone you want as an enemy. People who cross him have a tendency to disappear or suddenly lose their memory before trial." The next morning, Imani woke to find her suspension had been upgraded to termination, delivered via a text message that was both cowardly and expected. David Thompson couldn't even be bothered to fire her in person, choosing instead to hide behind corporate policy and the protection of his mob boss patron. But as she deleted the message, another notification caught her attention. A news alert about a small business owner on the east side who had been hospitalized after a mysterious assault. The victim had recently filed a complaint about being forced to pay protection money. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Imani screenshot the article and added it to her growing file, pieces of a puzzle that were beginning to form a recognizable shape. That afternoon, Don Marco Vittorio swept into Vittorio's like a conquering general returning to claim his trophy. He requested Imani's former section specifically, making a show of examining the wine list while regaling his companions with embellished tales of the previous evening's drama. Some people simply don't understand their place in society, Don Marco proclaimed loudly enough for the entire dining room to hear. "But I taught that little waitress a lesson she won't soon forget. If she's smart, she'll leave town before she learns what happens to people who disrespect the Vittorio family." The other servers moved through their duties with the careful precision of people who knew they were being watched and judged. Management had made it clear that any show of sympathy for their former colleague would result in immediate termination, or worse. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Don Marco Vittorio wielded it like a master craftsman. But Don Marco's victory tour was about to encounter an unexpected obstacle. As he pontificated about proper respect and social hierarchy, he failed to notice the woman in the business suit sitting 2 tables away, taking careful notes and recording every word on her phone. Imani had returned to Vittorio's not as a server, but as a customer, having used her emergency credit card to purchase a meal she couldn't afford, and clothes that transformed her from service worker to professional. The transformation was remarkable. The same woman who had been dismissed as insignificant yesterday now commanded respect from the hostess and deference from the waitstaff. Appearance was everything in this world, and Imani was learning to play by its rules. As Don Marco's voice rose with increasingly grandiose claims about his influence and power, he revealed information that made Imani's pulse quicken with anticipation. References to protection payments from local businesses, mentions of temporary relocations of assets to avoid federal scrutiny. and knowing comments about flexible law enforcement. "The East Side situation has been handled," Don Marco said casually to his lunch companion. "Sometimes business owners need to be reminded that protection isn't optional in this city. The hospital bills tend to teach people faster than words." All delivered with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. Don Marco Vittorio was confessing to extortion and assault in a room full of witnesses, recorded on a device that would preserve every incriminating word for posterity. The irony was beautiful in its simplicity. The same arrogance that had led him to humiliate a waitress was now providing the evidence needed to destroy him. Imani smiled as she saved the recording, adding another piece to the puzzle that was taking shape with stunning clarity. The game had begun, and Don Marco Vittorio had no idea he was already losing. 3 days later, Imani stood outside Vittorio's wearing her old server uniform, a calculated risk that could either provide the intelligence she needed or result in something far worse than a trespassing charge. She had called in a favor from Maria Santos, one of the few servers brave enough to maintain contact after her termination, who agreed to let her work a private catering shift for Don Marco's family dinner. The event was invitation only. 12 of the organization's most trusted members gathered in Vittorio's private dining room to discuss what the invitation cryptically referred to as family business matters. Imani adjusted her name tag and checked her hidden recording device one final time. Tonight she would gather the evidence needed to dismantle an empire built on violence and fear, one recorded confession at a time. The private dining room buzzed with the kind of conversation that happened when criminals believed themselves safely insulated from consequences. Don Marco held court at the head of the table, resplendent in a midnight blue Armani suit that cost more than most people's annual salaries, regaling his inner circle with tales of recent business triumphs, the beauty of cash businesses. He was saying as Imani refilled water glasses with practiced invisibility, is that money becomes wonderfully fluid. Numbers can dance between the restaurant, the laundromat, the car wash. Dirty money goes in, clean money comes out, and the IRS sees nothing but legitimate commerce. The men around the table chuckled appreciatively while they nodded with the kind of knowing smiles that came from years of operating outside the law. These were not people who worried about moral complications. As Imani moved through the room like a ghost in black and white, she caught fragments of conversation that could end criminal careers if recorded properly. Sal Torino, Don Marco's underboss, was discussing the finer points of territory expansion with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign. "The North End is ready," he explained, gesturing with a glass of expensive Chianti. "Most of the shop owners have already agreed to our protection services. The 3 who refused, well, they're reconsidering after last week's incidents." The casual admission of what amounted to systematic extortion hung in the air like expensive cologne. Overwhelming, obvious, and somehow completely ignored by everyone present except the woman serving their wine. Don Marco's voice cut through the murmur of criminal confession like a conductor calling his orchestra to attention. "Speaking of money management, we need to discuss our offshore situation. Some of our more liquid assets will be taking an extended vacation to the Cayman Islands, at least until this unfortunate federal investigation loses steam." He said the words with the kind of casual confidence that only came from a lifetime of believing that rules applied to other people. The guests nodded knowingly, several making notes on their phones to presumably make similar arrangements for their own operations. Imani's hands remained steady as she served the next course, but her mind was racing with the implications of what she was hearing. Don Marco Vittorio had just confessed to money laundering and obstruction of justice in front of a dozen witnesses. The conversation took an even more damaging turn when the topic shifted to recent territorial challenges. Tony Moretti's voice carried a note of satisfaction as he described his solution to a rival operation. "That Santino problem you asked me to handle? Consider it resolved," he said with a smirk. "He won't be testifying about anything ever. Sometimes people need to understand that cooperation with federal investigators is bad for their health." His meaning was clear to everyone in the room, and the nods of understanding confirmed that witness intimidation and worse were as common in their circle as Sunday dinner. Don Marco laughed, raising his wine glass in a mock toast. To creative problem-solving and permanent solutions to temporary problems. The glasses clinked together in a symphony of complicity, that would have federal investigators working overtime within the week. But Don Marco's triumph was about to encounter an unexpected complication. As Imani leaned over to refill his wine glass, the Mafia boss glanced up and recognition flickered across his face like lightning. "Wait a minute," Don Marco said slowly, his voice cutting through the dinner conversation like a blade. "I know you. You're that waitress from the other night, the one who was so disrespectful to me." The room fell silent as all attention focused on Imani, who found herself trapped in the spotlight of a dozen pairs of dangerous eyes. Her cover was blown, but the recording device in her pocket had already captured enough evidence to destroy everyone at this table. The question now was whether she could escape before Don Marco's anger turned into something more dangerous than public humiliation. Security. Don Marco's roar shattered the elegant atmosphere like a hammer through crystal. This woman was fired from this restaurant, and now she's obviously here to spy on us. The guests began murmuring among themselves, some reaching for phones, while others demanded explanations from their host. Sal Torino's face drained of color as he realized the implications of what had just happened. A former employee with obvious grievances against Don Marco had been listening to their private business discussions. The paranoia that came naturally to criminals began spreading through the room like wildfire. How much had she heard? What did she know? More importantly, what was she planning to do with whatever information she had gathered? Imani backed toward the service entrance as two of Don Marco's enforcers materialized from the shadows, their faces grim with purpose and their intentions clear. "I was just helping Maria with the catering," she said calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "Though I have to say this has been quite an educational evening. I've learned so much about creative accounting, territory management, and how to make problems disappear permanently." The subtle threat in her words was not lost on Don Marco, whose composure cracked visibly as fury tightened his jaw and fear widened his eyes. The Mafia boss had spent years wielding power through intimidation and violence, but he had never faced an opponent who possessed information that could destroy him. For the first time in his criminal life, Don Marco Vittorio was genuinely afraid. "Get her out of here immediately," Don Marco commanded, but his voice carried a note of panic that undermined his authority. "And I want her dealt with. Make sure she understands what happens to people who stick their noses in family business." The guards moved toward Imani, but she was already at the service door, her hand on the handle and freedom just seconds away. She turned back for one final look at the room full of criminals in expensive suits, memorizing faces and voices that would soon be explaining themselves to federal investigators. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Imani said with perfect politeness, her words carrying the weight of a promise and a threat combined. "I look forward to seeing you all again very soon, probably in federal court." As the service door closed behind her, Imani could hear Don Marco screaming at his men, demanding they find her and retrieve whatever recording equipment she might have used. But it was too late. The evidence was already beyond their reach, stored in multiple secure locations with copies prepared for the appropriate authorities. Don Marco Vittorio had underestimated his opponent once again, and this time, the mistake would cost him everything. The information was gathered, the confessions recorded, and justice was no longer a distant hope. It was inevitable. The law office of Marcus Washington occupied the 15th floor of a downtown high-rise, its windows offering a commanding view of the city that had tried to break both him and the woman sitting across from his mahogany desk. Marcus was a man who understood the weight of fighting systems designed to crush people like them. His Harvard law degree hung beside photos of civil rights leaders, and his track record of taking down organized crime families had earned him both respect and enemies in equal measure. "Miss Rose," he said, studying the flash drive she had placed before him like a chess piece. "What you've brought me today could change everything. But before we proceed, I need you to understand the risks involved in what you're proposing." His voice carried the gravity of someone who had seen too many witnesses disappear before they could testify. Imani leaned forward in her chair, her posture radiating the kind of determination that came from having nothing left to lose. "Mr. Washington, I've already lost my job, my reputation, and nearly my dignity. Don Marco Vittorio made it clear that he intends to ruin my life or possibly end it, simply because I refuse to kneel before him. The question isn't whether I'm willing to take risks. It's whether I'm going to let him get away with crimes that would put ordinary people in prison for life." She gestured toward the flash drive containing hours of recorded confessions from Vittorio's private dining room. These people think they're untouchable because they've never faced consequences for their actions. It's time someone showed them that the law applies to everyone, regardless of how many politicians they've bought or how many people they've threatened. Marcus picked up the flash drive and turned it over in his hands, weighing its potential impact against the certain retaliation it would provoke. I've been investigating organized crime for 15 years, and in that time, I've learned that people like Don Marco don't fight fair. They'll use every resource at their disposal to tear apart anyone who threatens their empire. Witnesses have disappeared. Families have been threatened. Evidence has been destroyed. He walked to his window, gazing down at the city where justice was supposed to be blind but often seemed to need prescription glasses when looking at the powerful. 3 years ago, Don Marco Vittorio destroyed the career of a young black prosecutor who was getting too close to his money laundering operations. He had him framed for evidence tampering, leaked false stories to the press, and made sure he never worked in law again. "Then why are you willing to help me?" Imani asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Marcus turned back to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that looked like old pain mixed with newer rage. "Because Don Marco Vittorio made a mistake when he decided to threaten my family at a public event last year," he said, his voice taking on an edge that could cut glass. He stood up in front of witnesses and suggested that lawyers like me should remember that everyone has loved ones who can be hurt. The memory clearly still burned, transforming the distinguished attorney into someone who understood exactly what Imani was fighting against. As Marcus played the recordings from the flash drive, his expression shifted from professional interest to barely contained excitement. Don Marco's voice filled the office, casually describing money laundering techniques with the expertise of a master criminal. Sal Torino's laughter echoed through the speakers as he toasted their creative solutions to business problems, while their associates nodded along like conspirators at a planning meeting. "This is incredible," Marcus whispered, pausing the recording to make notes. "We have conspiracy to commit racketeering, money laundering, extortion, witness tampering, and what sounds like conspiracy to commit murder. Any one of these charges could break him completely. But taken together, this is a RICO prosecutor's dream case. The evidence was damning, comprehensive, and ready for court presentation." Marcus began outlining their strategy with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. "We'll need to coordinate with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, but we have to be careful about timing. The Vittorios are clearly planning to move assets offshore, so we need to act fast enough to prevent them from escaping with their wealth and possibly fleeing the country." He pulled up federal databases on his computer, cross-referencing known associates and business entities with the information from Imani's recordings. "I've been building a network of other victims over the years. Small business owners whose shops were burned, witnesses who were intimidated into silence, families who lost loved ones to Don Marco's organization. With your evidence, we can finally give them the justice they've been denied." The scope of the Vittorio family's corruption was becoming clear, a web of ruined lives and stolen opportunities that stretched back decades. But their planning session was interrupted by Marcus's secretary, who knocked urgently on the door before entering with a concerned expression. "Mr. Washington, there are 2 men in the lobby. They're not saying who they work for, but they're asking very specific questions about Miss Rose and whether she's been in contact with you." The message was clear. Don Marco Vittorio's retaliation had already begun, faster than either of them had anticipated. Marcus and Imani exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the danger they were now facing. "They're being polite," the secretary continued, "but one of them has a gun visible under his jacket, and they're making it very clear they're not leaving until they get answers." The legal battle was about to become personal in ways that would test both their resolve and their safety. Marcus moved quickly to secure the recordings, making multiple encrypted copies of the flash drive while explaining their next steps to Imani. "We need to file with federal authorities immediately, before the Vittorios can claim the recordings were obtained illegally or destroy evidence. I'll reach out to my contact at the FBI. Agent Sarah Chen has been leading the RICO investigation into the Vittorio family for 5 years. She's been waiting for a break like this." He handed Imani a secure phone and a business card for a safe house service. "From this moment forward, you need to assume you're being watched. Don't go home tonight. Don't contact anyone from your old life unless it's through this encrypted phone. And don't trust anyone except me and the federal agents I'm going to introduce you to." As Imani prepared to leave through the building's service entrance, Marcus delivered one final piece of information that changed everything. "There's something else you should know about Don Marco Vittorio's pattern of targeting black professionals in this city. It's not random, and it's not just about protecting his criminal operations. He's part of a coordinated effort to maintain what he calls natural order." He showed her a folder containing documentation of 23 cases over the past decade where successful black professionals had been systematically targeted by the Vittorio organization. "You're not just fighting for your own justice, Imani. You're fighting for every person whose life he's deliberately ruined because of the color of their skin and his belief that certain people should know their place." But as Imani slipped out into the night, her phone buzzed with a text message that made her blood run cold. It was from the hospital where her mother was receiving treatment, marked urgent and requesting immediate contact. Dorothy Rose had taken a turn for the worse during the evening, her weakened immune system failing to fight off a secondary infection. The doctors were recommending emergency surgery that would cost $50,000, money Imani didn't have and couldn't possibly obtain through legitimate means. The alliance was formed and the legal machinery was in motion, but the cruelest test of her resolve had just begun. The hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant and desperation, a familiar combination that had haunted Imani's nights for months. She stood outside her mother's room, clutching the doctor's estimate for the emergency surgery. $50,000 that might as well have been $50 million. Dorothy Rose lay connected to machines that beeped out the rhythm of a life hanging in the balance, her once strong hands now fragile as autumn leaves against the stark white sheets. "The infection is aggressive," Dr. Martinez explained in the careful tone reserved for delivering impossible news. "Without immediate intervention, her immune system won't be able to fight it off. The surgery is her only chance. But I have to be honest about the financial reality. Your insurance will cover maybe 20%. The words hung in the sterile air like a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology. 3 days later, Imani found herself back at Vittorio's, wearing the uniform that felt like a costume from someone else's life. David Thompson had called personally, his voice dripping with false sympathy as he offered her old job back at reduced hours and lower pay. "Mr. Vittorio specifically requested that you be given a second chance," he had said, the lie so transparent it was almost insulting. "He believes in redemption and forgiveness, in giving people the opportunity to learn from their mistakes." The truth was simpler and more sinister. Don Marco wanted his enemy close, where she could be watched, controlled, and reminded daily of her powerlessness. Imani accepted the humiliation because her mother's life depended on the income, no matter how meager. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford when measured against the steady beep of life support machines. Don Marco's celebration transformed Vittorio's main dining room into a showcase of excess that would have made ancient emperors blush with shame. 50 of the city's most influential citizens gathered to celebrate the Mafia boss's 60th birthday, their designer gowns and tailored suits creating a human tapestry of wealth and corruption. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across tables laden with imported caviar, truffle-infused delicacies, and wines that cost more per bottle than most families spent on groceries in a month. Don Marco held court at the center of it all, resplendent in a custom Brioni tuxedo that hugged his frame like liquid silk. "Tonight is about celebrating not just another year of life," he announced to his assembled guests, "but another year of understanding exactly how this city works and who makes it work." As Imani moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, serving champagne to people who looked through her as if she were furniture, Don Marco's voice carried clearly across the room. "Some people in this city have forgotten their place recently," he was saying, his eyes finding Imani with predatory precision. "They've developed ideas above their station, thinking they can challenge those who were born to lead, who built this city from nothing and maintain order through strength and respect." The crowd murmured their agreement while phones discreetly emerged to capture what promised to be another display of Don Marco's power. "But I believe in teaching lessons that stick, in making sure that order is maintained and respect is earned through understanding one's position in the natural hierarchy." His smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and every word was calculated to remind Imani of her powerless position. The humiliation escalated as the evening progressed. each calculated insult designed to break down what remained of Imani's dignity. Don Marco demanded that she personally serve every course at the head table, ensuring maximum visibility for her subjugation. "My dear friends," Don Marco announced during the main course, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I want you all to meet someone special. This is Imani, a perfect example of how second chances can teach valuable lessons about knowing one's place and respecting those who provide opportunities." The introduction was delivered with the kind of patronizing tone usually reserved for describing trained animals performing tricks. "Tell everyone what you've learned, Imani. Share your newfound wisdom about respect and appropriate behavior." The request was phrased as a suggestion, but everyone in the room understood it was a command. Imani stood frozen in the spotlight of 50 pairs of expectant eyes, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. Her mother's face flashed through her mind, Dorothy Rose fighting for every breath while her daughter stood here being paraded like a trophy of submission. The hospital bills were mounting. The surgery couldn't wait much longer, and this job was her only lifeline to keeping her mother alive. Every instinct screamed at her to fight back, to reveal who she really was and what she knew about the criminal enterprise masquerading as legitimate business. But the steady beep of those life support machines echoed in her memory, drowning out the voice of rebellion with the sound of medical necessity. "I've learned," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "that everyone has their place in this world." The crowd leaned forward, sensing victory and eager to witness the complete capitulation of someone who had dared to challenge their established order. Don Marco's smile widened with each word, savoring the moment like fine wine. But as Imani continued speaking, something in her voice began to change, growing stronger despite the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "I've learned that some people believe they can buy respect, that money and fear can purchase the right to humiliate others without consequence." Her hand moved unconsciously to her pocket, where her mother's embroidered napkin rested against her heart like a talisman. "I've learned that there are people in this room who think their power makes them untouchable, that their crimes will never see the light of day because they can buy silence and eliminate witnesses." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the implications of her words began to sink in. Don Marco's triumphant expression faltered as he realized that his moment of victory was transforming into something else entirely. "That's enough," he snapped, his voice cutting through the sudden tension like a whip crack. "You're here to serve, not to lecture your betters about morality." His hand moved toward his jacket in a gesture that made several guests gasp. But Imani was no longer listening to commands from someone whose power was built on a foundation of violence and stolen money. The breaking point had been reached, and something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power between them. "You're right, Mr. Vittorio," Imani said, her voice now carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I am here to serve, but not in the way you think." She pulled out her phone, fingers dancing across the screen with practiced efficiency. "I'm here to serve justice, and it's about to be delivered." The room erupted into confused murmurs as guests began to realize that the evening's entertainment had taken an unexpected turn. Don Marco's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, anger, and finally the cold fear of someone who suddenly understood that they had underestimated their opponent catastrophically. "Security," he screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of Imani's phone connecting to the restaurant's sound system. Marcus Washington's voice filled the room, calm and professional, as he began reading from a federal warrant that had been filed that very afternoon. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Attorney Marcus Washington, representing the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Organized Crime Task Force. We have credible evidence of racketeering, money laundering, extortion, and conspiracy to obstruct justice involving several individuals present at this gathering." The recording continued as guests frantically reached for phones, some calling lawyers while others desperately tried to calculate their own exposure to the Vittorio family's criminal enterprise. Don Marco stood frozen at the head of the room, his perfect appearance unable to hide the terror spreading across his face like spilled wine on white silk. The federal investigation had moved with the precision and speed of a military operation once Marcus delivered Imani's recordings to the appropriate authorities. FBI forensic accountants had spent 72 hours straight tracing the digital breadcrumbs of the Vittorio financial empire, following money through a maze of legitimate businesses, cash operations, and fraudulent transactions that spanned multiple states. Agent Sarah Chen, lead investigator for the Organized Crime Task Force, had called it the most comprehensive RICO case she'd built in 15 years of federal service. These people didn't just break the rules. She had told Marcus during their final briefing. They created their own criminal system designed specifically to extort businesses, launder money, and eliminate anyone who stood in their way. The documentation was overwhelming in both its scope and precision. Don Marco's restaurant chain had been systematically used to launder drug money and proceeds from illegal gambling operations. The organization had been extorting small business owners across 3 neighborhoods, collecting over $2 million annually in protection payments. They had bribed city officials, intimidated witnesses, and were suspected in the disappearance of at least 4 people who had threatened to cooperate with federal investigators. The family had transferred over $50 million to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, using a complex network of shell companies with names like Metropolitan Services LLC and Tri-State Holdings Group. Each transaction had been carefully crafted to avoid detection by automated banking systems. But human analysis revealed patterns that painted a clear picture of deliberate criminal intent. Imani's financial analysis skills, honed through years of MBA coursework and practical application, had proven invaluable in mapping the Vittorio family's criminal network. She had spent 3 sleepless nights creating spreadsheets and flowcharts that traced every dollar from its illegal source to its hidden destination, building a case so comprehensive that even the most expensive defense attorneys would struggle to create reasonable doubt. The beauty of financial crimes, she had explained to Marcus while building their presentation, is that criminals always leave a trail. They can't help themselves. They need documentation to keep track of their own lies and to prove to their associates that money is being properly distributed. Her analysis had identified 23 separate violations of federal racketeering laws, each carrying potential prison sentences that could add up to life behind bars. But as the federal case gained momentum, Don Marco Vittorio had launched his own desperate counterattack, designed to discredit and intimidate the witnesses building the prosecution against him. Private investigators had been following Imani and Marcus for days, photographing their meetings and attempting to dig up compromising information that could be used to question their credibility. Anonymous tips had been called into the FBI suggesting that the recordings were fabricated, that evidence had been planted by disgruntled former employees seeking revenge. Don Marco had even sent someone to the hospital where Dorothy Rose was being treated, making inquiries about her treatment and financial situation in what was clearly a thinly veiled threat. The psychological warfare was immense, designed to erode Imani's willpower before the case could reach trial. Don Marco's lawyers had filed restraining orders claiming harassment, while his public relations team leaked stories suggesting that a troubled former waitress was making false accusations to extort money from a respected businessman and community leader. The attacks were coordinated and professional, targeting not just Imani's credibility, but her mental health and family stability. "She wants you to break," Marcus had warned during one of their secure phone conversations. "He's betting that the strain will force you to make mistakes or simply give up entirely. But what he doesn't understand is that every attack he makes, every threat, every attempt at intimidation, creates more documentation of obstruction of justice and witness tampering." The final piece came from an unexpected source, Don Marco's own accountant, who had been quietly documenting his client's illegal activities for years as insurance against exactly this type of investigation. Harold Brennan had worked for the Vittorio family for over a decade, creating the financial instruments they used to hide their wealth, while keeping detailed records of every transaction in case he needed to protect himself from prosecution. When FBI agents appeared at his office with a search warrant, he had handed over boxes of documents that corroborated every detail of Imani's analysis. "I've been waiting for someone to finally investigate these people," he told Agent Chen during his debriefing. "What they've been doing isn't just illegal, it's terrorism against honest business owners who just want to make a living without being extorted. The protection racket alone has destroyed dozens of immigrant families who couldn't afford to pay and were too afraid to go to the police." The evidence trail was now complete and irrefutable. A mountain of financial documents, recorded confessions, and witness testimony that painted a picture of systematic criminal behavior spanning decades. Don Marco Vittorio had stolen millions from legitimate businesses, corrupted public officials at every level of city government, and used violence and intimidation to maintain his criminal empire. The case file ran to over 3,000 pages, but the core facts were simple enough for any jury to understand. The Vittorio family had built their empire on fear, theft, and the suffering of others. Federal prosecutors were confident that they had enough material to secure convictions that would result in decades of prison time and the complete forfeiture of the Vittorio fortune. As news of the investigation began to leak to the media, Don Marco made one final desperate attempt to buy his way out of justice. Through intermediaries, he offered Imani a payment of $100,000 in exchange for recanting her testimony and admitting that the recordings had been fabricated. The offer came with veiled threats about what might happen to her mother's medical care if she refused to cooperate, but also with promises of ongoing payments that could solve all of Dorothy Rose's health problems permanently. "Think about what really matters," the message had said. "Your mother's life is worth more than some abstract concept of justice. We can make all her medical bills disappear. We can set you both up for life. All you have to do is say you made a mistake, that you misunderstood what you heard." But Imani's response had been swift and unambiguous. Justice wasn't abstract when it meant preventing other families from being destroyed by people who believed their power put them above the law. The web they had built to hide their crimes now pulled them under with inexorable force. Don Marco Vittorio's empire of corruption was crumbling as federal prosecutors prepared charges that would reshape how organized crime was prosecuted in federal court. Tomorrow, the handcuffs would click shut on wrists more accustomed to gold bracelets, and a new chapter in the fight for justice would begin. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel had been transformed into a glittering temple of false philanthropy, where 200 of the city's most influential citizens had gathered for Don Marco Vittorio's annual charity gala, supposedly benefiting children's hospitals. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in silk, while servers moved through the crowd carrying champagne and canapes that cost more per bite than many families spent on dinner. Don Marco stood at the center of it all, resplendent in a custom Tom Ford tuxedo, accepting praise and donations with the grace of someone who had perfected the art of appearing legitimate. "Tonight, we celebrate the power of giving," he announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions. "We celebrate the responsibility that comes with success and the obligation to lift up those less fortunate than ourselves, to give back to the community that has given us so much." It was breathtaking in its audacity, the spectacle of a criminal preaching generosity while positioning himself as a champion of the disadvantaged. Local television crews captured every moment of his performance, broadcasting live to viewers across the city, who had no idea they were watching a crime boss in his final hours of freedom. Don Marco's speech about compassion and social responsibility drew thunderous applause from an audience that included judges, politicians, and business leaders who would soon be answering uncomfortable questions about their own connections to the Vittorio organization. "We must never forget," Don Marco continued, his voice rising with practiced emotion, "that with great power comes great responsibility. We must use our resources not just to enrich ourselves, but to build a better world for future generations, to protect the vulnerable and maintain order in our communities." The words dripped with false sincerity as he gestured toward the donation displays, showing photographs of sick children and struggling families. The moment of reckoning arrived, disguised as just another guest making her way through the crowd. Imani Rose entered the ballroom, not through the service entrance she had used for months, but through the main doors, walking with the confidence of someone who belonged in this world of power and privilege. Gone was the black server's uniform that had rendered her invisible to these people. In its place, she wore a tailored navy business suit that transformed her from servant to equal, her posture radiating the authority that came from years of MBA training and months of meticulous preparation. The transformation was so complete that several guests who had looked through her countless times now found themselves drawn to her presence, sensing something different about the woman moving through their ranks with such quiet purpose. Don Marco's triumphant smile faltered when he spotted Imani approaching the stage, recognition flickering across his face like lightning before a storm. His hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, but his bodyguards were positioned too far away to intervene quickly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Imani's voice cut through the ballroom chatter with the clarity of someone trained to command boardrooms. I'm Dr. Imani Rose, and I have something important to share with you tonight. Something that will change how you see the man you're celebrating. The crowd turned as one, drawn by the unexpected interruption of their carefully choreographed evening. Don Marco moved toward the microphone, clearly intending to regain control of his event, but Imani was already speaking with the kind of authority that came from possessing information that could change lives. Many of you know me as the waitress who served your tables at Vittorio's, the invisible woman who brought your drinks and cleaned up your messes. But what you don't know is that I hold an MBA from Harvard Business School, and I've spent the past 3 months documenting the criminal enterprise that has been operating in this city under the guise of legitimate business. Gasps rippled through the room as guests began to realize that their evening of self-congratulation was about to become something else entirely. Don Marco's face cycled through emotions, confusion, rage, and finally the cold fear of someone who suddenly understood that their world was crumbling in real time. "Security," he shrieked, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of Imani connecting her phone to the ballroom sound system. The recorded voice of Don Marco Vittorio filled the space, casually discussing extortion techniques with the enthusiasm of someone describing a successful business venture. "The North End is ready," his voice echoed off the gilded walls. "Most of the shop owners have already agreed to our protection services. The 3 who refused, well, they're reconsidering after last week's incidents." As the recordings continued, painting a picture of systematic criminal behavior that spanned years, the audience's confusion transformed into something approaching horror. These were their friends, their business associates, their fellow pillars of the community, casually discussing crimes that would have sent ordinary citizens to prison for decades. Sal Torino's voice joined the symphony of incrimination, laughing as he described making a problem disappear permanently, while the dinner guests nodded along like conspirators at a planning meeting. "That Santino problem you asked me to handle? Consider it resolved. He won't be testifying about anything ever." The timing was perfect, the context undeniable, and the implications staggering for everyone in the room. Imani stood at the podium like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, her voice calm and professional, as she methodically dismantled the facade of respectability that had protected the Vittorio family for decades. "Over $50 million have been extorted from small business owners in this city," she announced, her words carrying clearly to every corner of the ballroom and to the television cameras broadcasting live across the region. "Money taken from immigrant families, from struggling entrepreneurs, from people who work 70 hours a week just to keep their businesses open, all stolen through threats and violence by the man you're celebrating tonight." She displayed financial charts and transaction records on the ballroom's projection screens, each document another nail in the coffin of Don Marco's carefully constructed public image. The chandeliers seemed to flicker as if the room itself recoiled from the weight of truth being spoken. And then the doors burst open as FBI agents flooded in, their badges gleaming under the crystal light like medals of justice, finally arriving to collect its due. Agent Sarah Chen led the parade of federal law enforcement, her voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. "Marco Vittorio, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit racketeering, money laundering, extortion, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice." The cold snap of steel handcuffs replaced the soft clink of jewelry, the sound of justice claiming its due. Don Marco's carefully maintained composure began to crack as the reality of his situation set in. The man who had commanded respect through fear and violence was reduced to desperate pleas for mercy that fell on deaf ears. "You don't understand," he cried, looking back at Imani with fury and desperation that bordered on madness. "I built this city. I kept order when no one else could. I gave you a chance to know your place, to walk away with money and your life." His voice rose to a roar that echoed off the ballroom walls like the cry of a wounded predator. But Imani stood unmoved, her expression calm, as she watched justice finally catch up with someone who had believed himself untouchable for far too long. "Mr. Vittorio," she said quietly, her words carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "The only place I belong is standing right here, watching you face the consequences of your actions. That's something you can think about for the next 25 years. Tears of rage and humiliation streaked Don Marco's face. The same humiliation he'd once forced on others now returned with interest. Federal agents began moving through the crowd, serving subpoenas to several shocked guests whose connections to the Vittorio organization would now be scrutinized by investigators. The audience froze in disbelief as expensive shoes shuffled toward exits and guests began to file out, many of them already calculating their own exposure to the federal investigation that would surely follow. Politicians who had accepted donations, business owners who had paid protection money, and officials who had looked the other way were all now part of a case that would dominate headlines for months. Imani remained at the podium, looking out over the wreckage of what had once seemed like an impenetrable fortress of criminal power. The woman who had been dismissed as just another server had proven that knowledge was the ultimate equalizer, that truth could topple an empire built on fear and violence. In the silence that followed, truth stood taller than power, and justice finally had a face. 6 months after the Metropolitan Hotel Gala that had shocked the city to its core, the federal courthouse buzzed with reporters and spectators eager to witness the final act of the Vittorio drama. Judge Margaret Thompson's gavel echoed through the packed courtroom as she delivered sentences that would reshape how organized crime was prosecuted in America. Marco Vittorio, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The judge announced, her voice carrying the weight of justice long delayed. Your systematic exploitation of honest business owners, your corruption of public officials, and your use of violence and intimidation to maintain criminal control over entire neighborhoods represents everything our justice system was designed to prevent. Salvatore Torino, you are sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for your role as underboss and enforcer of this criminal enterprise. The men who had once commanded respect through fear and violence now sat in orange jumpsuits, their empire reduced to ashes and their future measured in decades behind bars. The forfeiture hearing that followed was equally devastating to the Vittorio legacy. Federal prosecutors had traced every stolen dollar through the labyrinth of legitimate businesses and cash operations, recovering over $50 million in property, vehicles, and bank accounts that would be distributed to the victims who had suffered under their regime of extortion. The Vittorio mansion, their collection of luxury vehicles, the restaurant chain, and the various businesses used as fronts were all seized by federal agents. The very wealth they had used to corrupt officials and silence victims was now funding restitution payments to the families they had terrorized. Imani Rose stood on the courthouse steps, no longer the invisible waitress who had been dismissed and humiliated, but the whistleblower whose courage had exposed decades of systematic corruption. The settlement check in her briefcase represented $2 million in compensation for her lost wages, emotional distress, and the critical role she had played in bringing down a criminal organization. But more importantly, it represented validation that her fight had been worth the cost. Dorothy Rose's medical bills were now a memory, her cancer treatment complete and successful thanks to the financial security her daughter had fought so hard to achieve. The machines that had once beeped out the rhythm of borrowed time now sat silent in hospital storage rooms, their work complete. The transformation in Imani's life was as dramatic as the fall of her former tormentors. Rose Financial Consulting occupied a gleaming office in the heart of downtown, its mission statement etched in gold letters on the lobby wall: empowering communities through financial justice and protecting small businesses from exploitation. The firm specialized in helping minority-owned businesses navigate the complex world of corporate finance while providing pro bono services to families struggling with predatory lending practices and to business owners who had been victims of extortion. Imani's team of analysts worked with the same precision that had brought down the Vittorios, but now their skills were used to build up rather than tear down. The waiting room was always full of entrepreneurs seeking guidance, community leaders planning economic development projects, and former victims of the Vittorio organization learning how to rebuild their businesses without fear. Vittorio's underwent its own dramatic transformation in the wake of the scandal. David Thompson's termination had been swift and permanent, his years of enabling criminal activity finally catching up with him when federal investigators discovered his role in helping the organization launder money through the restaurant. The establishment was sold at auction and reopened under new management with a new name, Rose Garden Bistro, as a tribute to the woman who had brought justice to the city. The servers who had once feared to speak out against intimidation now worked in an environment where their voices were heard and their contributions valued. The changes rippled through the entire restaurant and hospitality industry as other establishments rushed to examine their own practices and distance themselves from any appearance of mob connection. Dorothy Rose's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, her cancer retreating in the face of the best medical care money could buy. She spent her days volunteering at the community center, teaching financial literacy classes to adults who had been denied educational opportunities in their youth. My daughter showed this city that intelligence and determination matter more than violence and fear. Dorothy would tell anyone who would listen. She proved that justice isn't just a word in law books. It's something worth fighting for no matter the cost, no matter how powerful the enemy. On a quiet Tuesday evening, Imani returned to the renamed Rose Garden Bistro, not as an employee or consultant, but as a customer celebrating her mother's clean bill of health and the one-year anniversary of Don Marco's conviction. She wore the same navy business suit from the night she had exposed the Vittorio conspiracy, and in her purse, she carried the white napkin embroidered with Dr. Imani Rose, MBA. No longer a hidden reminder of her worth, but a trophy of a battle won against impossible odds. The server who brought their wine was a young black woman whose confident posture and professional demeanor spoke of opportunities that had been created by the changes Imani's courage had unleashed. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, free from the undercurrent of fear that had once permeated every interaction. As mother and daughter raised their glasses in a toast to survival and justice, Imani reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The woman who had once feared for her mother's life now sat in the same dining room where Don Marco Vittorio had tried to break her spirit. But Don Marco was gone, his influence vanquished, serving his sentence in a maximum security federal prison where the power he had wielded meant nothing. And in his place stood a new generation of leaders who understood that true power came not from fear and violence, but from the courage to stand up for what was right. The restaurant hummed with the sound of honest conversation and genuine laughter, a stark contrast to the tense silence that had once dominated when the mob boss held court. Small business owners dined without fear, families celebrated without looking over their shoulders, and servers worked with dignity knowing that no one could threaten them with impunity. Imani's phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Washington, who had just won another RICO case against a different criminal organization, this one inspired by the precedent set by the Vittorio prosecution. The ripple effects of her courage were spreading throughout the city's justice system. As the evening drew to a close, Imani and Dorothy walked out into the cool night air, free from the shadow of fear that had once defined their lives. The city lights sparkled with possibility rather than danger, and the streets that had once belonged to criminals now belonged to everyone. Justice had been served not through violence or revenge, but through courage, intelligence, and an unwavering refusal to accept that power could trump truth. The woman who had been ordered to kneel had instead stood tall, and in doing so she had changed everything. Don Marco Vittorio had learned the hardest lesson of his criminal life, that dignity cannot be stolen, that truth is more powerful than intimidation, and that sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one who will bring your entire world crashing down. In the end, the Mafia boss who everyone feared had been brought to tears not by violence or threats, but by something far more powerful. The quiet strength of a woman who refused to be broken, and the unstoppable force of justice finally claiming what it was owed.